I've debated posting this for a while, mainly because I'm not a writer. It's a long story, apologies in advance for the length, and I don't want to mess it up in the telling. This happened to me and my friend Sam 3 winters ago. We liked exploring nature and walking around outside. Our friends had recently introduced us to this beautiful place in Wisconsin, Grant Park for anyone familiar with southeastern Wisconsin parks, that we had visited with them 3 or 4 times. Every time we had gone with them, it was an extremely pleasant trip. We walked around, got to see some beautiful views of Lake Michigan, sat in crooks of trees and talked about books and games and all other manner of things. We had been starting a new game of Hunter the Darkness, a tabletop RPG game like Dungeons & Dragons. We were using the park for a bit of scenic inspiration. It was pretty great, actually. For the purpose of storytelling, my friend and I are 5'2/5'3" females. The first time she and I went alone, we went around dusk to take some pictures we could Photoshop for the game. The park was massive. There were many bridges, footpaths, and winding roads throughout. We were walking over this bridge that sat against one of the roads, with dense woods on either side. As we were crossing, this car drives slowly by and rolls down the window. Some guy we don't know leans out and says, "Hey," at us. We were both startled and jumped in surprise, but we dismissed them and continued walking across the bridge. Less than a minute later, that same car comes driving the other direction. This time the driver's side window rolls down, and the driver, another male, calls out to us, "Hey ladies, come here." We picked up our pace. The car drives away, and right as we're about to hit the end of the bridge, we see it come at us again from the original direction. We book it up into the trees, up the hill, and hear the car stop, and the 2 men start to yell for us. We continued running, and hid in the dark for 15 or so minutes until they left. We ran back to our car and drove away. You would think we would avoid this park after that, but once we had gotten out of there and properly warmed over a hot chocolate from Perkins, we had a good laugh over having been so scared. We went back to the park with our male friends a few times. Nothing even remotely scary had happened, so she and I decided to go back, again, just the 2 of us. Sam and I often spent our afternoons and early evenings exploring the outside, hiking, geocaching, just sitting outside in parks and talking, so we had just decided to add it to our repertoire. We headed back around dusk again, with the camera ready to take more pictures, especially since we hadn't gotten the shots we wanted to the first time. Now obviously, looking back on this, we both feel incredibly foolish having gone back alone, and around the same time and same place as well. As I said though, we had gone a few more times with our male friends, and even when we had just 1 male with us, nothing had happened, so we thought we were just being skittish. Anyways, we did go back, and were about to walk over the same bridge, when a car rolls by, and as you guessed, the window rolls down. Some guy just yells out this random noise. This time though, we don't wait for them to drive around. We duck out into the woods and start walking back toward the pier. We figured we'd abandon the other photo spot, and just explore the pier and take some like shots instead. Not exactly what we were looking for, but we figured if we made it in time for the sunset, which was almost all the way down at that point, we could take some nice pictures over the lake just for fun. The way that the pier is set up is that there is a long, thin road from the top of a giant grass hill, down and around a curve and into the parking lot. The pier is right at the end of the right side of the parking lot, about 200 yards away. If you walked from near the pier down the right side of the lot, there was a little bridge that led to a development with a tennis court that sat right next to the preserve. We began walking down the road to the lake when the same car from before drives down into the parking lot by the pier. They didn't say anything as they drove past this time. We still decided to slow down and decide whether or not we wanted to continue going to the pier. The car turned around in the parking lot and came back up the road. It reached where we were and suddenly stopped. We immediately turned and started walking down the hill. All of the windows rolled down at once. We could see that there were 4 guys and 1 girl in the car. "Hello." Sam and I turned around and waved. One of them called out, "Hey, you're cute." The others joined in. Hey, yeah, wait for us. Now mind you, we're two small females, but we're also super bundled up in large winter coats and hats. You could barely see any of our faces or our shapes, so they really didn't have a lot to base this sentence on. We had been ignoring them when we hear someone call out, "We're coming back for you," as they drive up the hill. Sam and I decided not to take any chances. We started running now. We hear hooting and hollering and see them disappear over the top of the hill. We start running toward the bridge, and once you've gotten over the bridge to the left, there was a concrete deck with a drop-off to a ramp about 5 feet tall, so that if you got off the bridge and jumped down right away, you'd be at the bottom of the ramp. You couldn't be seen from the other side if you ducked down, which is exactly what we did. We hear the car speed back down the hill, all 4 doors open and close, as they start screaming and laughing. "Hey, come here, girls. We'll be nice. We just want to play." Most of them took off to the pier, but 2 of them stayed behind. We could make out bits and pieces of what they were saying. "Hey, where do you think they went?" "I don't know, we'll find them." Sam and I were huddled and obviously freaked out. Once it had been silent near the bridge for a while, we decided to peek out to see if the other 2 had also left so we could sneak back up the hill, or maybe make a break for it somewhere else. We peek over. There's a guy on the other end of the bridge, clearly staring at us. "Over here!" he screams to his buddies. He starts running across the bridge to us. We take off toward the development, running around the side of the tennis court, while being chased by 3 of the guys. Only one of them was very close to us, about 30 feet away, but the rest were catching up faster than we would have liked. We took a quick turn between 2 houses in the subdivision. We luckily never saw them again from that point on. We got back to our car by walking through the forest preserve incredibly slowly, dashing across roads, terrified out of our minds. We left that night and called our friends we normally went to the preserve with. From then on, they insisted on accompanying us any time we went out there. Throwaway account. I wanted to write this story for over a year, but didn't know if people would find it interesting. Here goes, I guess. This happened in the early thousands. I was probably in 1st grade, or maybe a year younger. This took place in Bulgaria. I'm from a mid-sized town. Not too small, not too big. The perfect size for raising your children. Crime is pretty much unheard of. You can sleep outside on a bench and nothing would happen to you. One weekend, some family friends from a nearby town came to my town to visit, and my parents and I decided to go to the park with them. It's important to say that all of the parks in my town are located right on the edge of town. So they're basically a combination of park and forest. At some point, the park just merges right in. Since it's not a very big town, we don't have central parks. In the park that we went to, it runs along a river, so it's a very narrow alley, but a very long one. On one side, there's the river. On the other, there's the thick forest and the cliffs. At that time, I didn't like that park so much, because it was a very long walk, and you had to walk a lot to get to the end of it. So, like most kids, I got bored of walking with my parents and the other family, since they were talking about grown-up stuff and I didn't want to listen to them. I decided to run off ahead, and by ahead I mean completely out of sight from my parents. Keep in mind that this is a one-alley park, which you walk only straight forward with slight curves due to the river, so I had gone pretty far ahead. Usually in this park there are always people, and it's quite crowded on the weekends. Since it was summer, most of the people were on family vacations though. It was surprisingly empty, and I couldn't see anyone in a straight line either way. At that point, I started to hear something in the forest. It was pretty loud since on the other side was the river, and that was loud by itself. I stopped and started staring in. I saw how the bushes were moving around and coming toward my direction. I was still pretty clueless to what was happening until I saw a man with long hair, a band across his forehead, dressed like a hunter with an air rifle on his back, running full speed towards me. There was no freezing moment. I just started bolting in the opposite direction, screaming my lungs out for my parents, hoping they could hear me. Because of the sound of the rushing river, though, I doubted anyone could have heard me from 100 meters away. I remember looking backward, seeing him still chasing me, and thinking to myself, maybe this is the end. It's over. I was imagining how he would catch me and drag me back into the forest, and I would never see my family or friends again. It felt like an eternity of running, but finally I saw my parents and our family friends. My whole face was completely red. I was crying and snotting like crazy, barely breathing. The hunter also stopped running after he saw my parents and the others. I remember they started screaming at him. What the hell was he doing? I don't remember what exactly he said. I was just relieved it was over. I remember him slowly shaking his head, saying, "I did nothing wrong. I was only trying to help him." The weirdest part was that there's no game in that park. It's a park after all, and the forest that he was hiding in is max 50 meters in width before the cliffs begin. It's impossible to have any game there since there are always people walking. You can see wild foxes, but that's about it. You need to go well beyond the park into the forest to hunt any game. Also, it's highly illegal to carry a firearm out in public. We have very strict laws on firearms. Only police and military personnel are allowed to carry them. I don't know anyone who owns a gun. Civilians are allowed to register only air guns for hunting. No hardcore weapons allowed. Of course, you're not allowed to carry them in a park where there are people either. Only in regulated zones for hunting game, away from the populated areas. You would never see hunters like that unless you go deep into these zones or you're in a village, which is very rare. No, we didn't report it afterward. Too much hassle. This was the first and last time something like that has happened to me ever, thankfully, and I haven't developed a fear of that place. Even now, when I go back to my town, I go running in that park after midnight, and I'm usually perfectly fine, so I have no idea what that was. This happened almost 2 years ago. I had decided to go hiking with my son, who was 8 months old at the time, and my dog Henry, an Irish Wolfhound Rottweiler mix. My husband was going fishing with a mutual friend at a state park nearby. I decided to go hike one of the more remote trails in a different part of the park and meet up with them later. I drove to a wooded trail about 10 minutes from where my husband was fishing. It was an early spring day, still chilly but tolerable with the sun shining down. I parked the car and got my son ready. He was laughing and smiling. I would wear him in a forward-facing hiking sling in front of me at the time. Henry was sniffing around and whining excitedly, as if to say, "Let's go." We started off on the hike, and it was a really beautiful, peaceful trail. The towering trees mixed with pine. A crystal-clear creek wove its way through the trail at different points. We would periodically stop and play, all three of us together. About an hour and a half into the hike, we had gone 2.5 or around 3 miles and rounded a narrow bend in the trail when we nearly collided with a gentleman in his late 40s or early 50s. Henry began snarling and lunging for the man before I could even completely register what was going on. I quickly backed up and pulled Henry back the best I could. My bumps were goosed at this point. Henry just would not calm down. This was very unusual behavior for him, but not if he was trying to protect us. Trying to talk over Henry, I loudly said, "I'm sorry, Henry is just very protective of my son. If you move off to the side, we can pass right by you." My son was very quiet during this entire exchange too, which I found a bit odd. The man was staring very intently at him. Then he laughed slightly and said, "Oh, he should be. It's a good thing he's with you." He motioned to something around his neck and said, "I'm just out here taking some pictures. It's a hobby of mine, you could say." Except he wasn't wearing any kind of camera around his neck, or anywhere I could see. He had a canteen. I politely asked him again to step aside so that we could pass. At this point, Henry was sitting down but growling still. Henry would not take his eyes off this guy. I have no doubt that Henry would have eviscerated this man if he tried anything. and I'm positive this guy felt that as well. The man stared at Henry for a few moments, then looked back at my son once again. He took a few steps off trail, so there was room to get by. At that point, Henry couldn't reach him when we walked by. As I walked by him, he was about 10 feet to my left at this point. He muttered something about how he used to be able to see his kids. I kept looking back as we walked away to make sure he didn't turn around and start walking after us. He continued to stare at us for several minutes, though, until I could no longer see him. We kept hiking and eventually came to an opening point where cars could park. There was no one there, and luckily I had cell phone reception. I called my husband. He and his friend came to pick us up right away. Then they took us back to my car. There was no sign of the guy we encountered on the trail. We went home after that. Henry has since passed away. I'm sad my son doesn't get to grow up with him. He really was the best dog ever. I know everyone says that about their dog, but he really was. This is truly the scariest, most horrible thing that's ever happened to me. I have never been so petrified in my entire life. To this day, I still do not know who this man was, what he was trying to do, or if he still is where I saw him. I'm sorry for how long this geographical description is. I just want everyone to understand how secluded I was when this happened, and how badly it could have ended if not for my parents. I was back home for the summer for the first time in a year after starting uni. Our home was, and still is, just outside of a small town, with forests on all sides. There was also a small man-made lake, which was diverged from a river that ran for miles through the forest and ramified into a few small streams east of the lake. Near my home, there was a small grassy path that led to the river following a stream. It was a long walk, but one I used to go on often as a child. I knew the forest there quite well. I knew where I could cut through dense trees to meet the stream. The walk I would go on always led me off the path which turned northwest slowly, so away from the stream, then took a sharp turn to the west after a few miles' walk, at which point the stream was hidden quite deep into the forest. I'd continue to walk north and follow the stream through the forest to get to the river, then follow the river west to get to the lake. It's easy to get lost in this forest, because the terrain isn't just a slope down to the water. It goes up and down, and you end up completely surrounded by trees. I'd spent many days wandering around there alone or with my dad over the span of 18 years. Never, in my entire time doing this, did I ever see anyone else in that forest. I went there twice that summer, both times alone-ish. The first time I left in the morning, I walked along the path away from the stream to the sharp bend, then cut back into the forest. I reached the stream after an hour or so. As I was running my hands in the water, I heard a bell from far away, coming from the north. Something was making a bell ring fervently and periodically, which I found quite strange. I listened well, wondered if it was a lost hunting dog, and started moving toward the sound. Yeah, I know, I'd be the first person to die in a horror movie, but I was heading north anyway, so what the hell? I realized it couldn't have been an animal, though. I could tell the bell was too heavy because of how clear the sound was to be on a collar. I kept moving, and the bell was moving away from me. It stopped completely after 5 minutes. The stream wasn't big or strong enough to carry a bell like that could have been enclosed in a tin or something, and the river was far too still. I thought of everything, but nothing could explain that sound, apart from one obvious thing, which I didn't feel comfortable with for some reason. I knew it had to have been a person. I stopped thinking about it and just walked on normally. That is, until I found a badger. A bloomin' dead one. Carefully decapitated. It had obviously been done with a knife. It was fairly fresh. The body was still limp, and there wasn't too much smell coming from it. The wound was full of maggots, but I knew that happened soon after exposure. The sound of the bell had been following the stream, and so had I. So the badger was put there, maybe killed there, at least decapitated while I was walking that way. I suppose I don't know really. Nothing else happened for the rest of that day. 1 week later, I went back for the second time that summer, and the last time ever. I left home at around 6 p.m. I made it to the stream, then walked to the river in an hour, then decided to go back the way I came. It was getting late and was starting to rain quite heavily. The sun set at around 9 p.m. I was walking as fast as I could. The sound of the rain in the trees was surreal and loud. I was somewhat trotting with my head down for a while through the clearest and most open part of the forest when I bumped into something heavy. The smell was sickly. It was the decomposing body of the badger with his head strung to his front paws. It looked a bit like a ham because of the way it was tied, just swinging from a tree, almost like a literal load of bollocks. It was this putrid bag of stench, wet and dripping green liquid. I started gagging. I could feel some sort of mucus-textured fluid in my hair. It was repulsive. At first I just stared at it, slightly gobsmacked. Then I started fidgeting violently. I felt like I was drenched in its juices. I was soaking from the rain, and my senses became confused. It felt like a bucket of ice-cold water had been thrown over me when I realized that I walked the same way to get to the river. So someone had strung the body up after I'd passed it on the way there. Someone who knew I would see it. So, was someone watching me? Running around the forest? With the faint sounds of those branches breaking around me? Not just animals? I looked around nervously and started jogging. I was half running, half walking away from the stream back toward the path for a while, when I heard that bell again. I proceeded to call my dad while running. I told him to meet me on the path where it sharply turns west. It was the closest part to me, to go as fast as he could, and that someone was with me in the forest. I can't explain the feeling I had. It was like I just shit out my intestines and stomach. I literally felt the hairs on my neck raise, despite being completely soaked. It was dark. I jogged as fast as I could. I was panicking because the path was still a bit far away, just too far to feel safe. It was still raining. Every single sound was muffled. I felt like everything was further away than ever before. The bell went on way longer than the last time, on and off. It felt like it was surrounding me at one point. The fear, combined with my compromised hearing and the fact that I couldn't flip and breathe properly, was making me lose my sense of direction. I was automatically heading southwest, but I wasn't sure what I was even doing. I was breathing like a goddamn horse, coughing my lungs up, kind of crying out loud like a toddler does, tripping over leaves and twigs like an idiot. I stayed on the phone with my mom, who was on her way with my dad. I kept hearing all these sounds around me. I wasn't sure what they were. My mom was screaming on the phone at the same time that they were on the path. I needed to run, that my dad had gotten out and was heading east from the path bend. I was terrified, so I went into survival mode. I was doing the half-running, half-speed-walking thing again because I was completely out of breath. Suddenly, I heard branches break, clear footsteps for the first time from down in the forest, and that bell ringing louder. I didn't want to, but I looked over my shoulder. That's when I saw what was in the forest with me. A tall figure creeping in my direction at the very end of the clearing, ringing this bell slowly in front of his stomach. I could tell he was staring straight at me. I don't know if I have a hidden secret sprinting ability or instinctual adrenaline-induced superhuman powers, but when I tell you I ran for my life, I fucking didn't look back once. I screamed as loud as I could. I lied. I'm on the phone with the police. They're on the path already. Dad, I can see you. I'm here. I wanted to yell, Dad, please, where are you? But I kept that part to myself. I could feel something awful was going to happen. I felt the man right behind me. I kept telling myself not to look back. I was gasping and wheezing, crying so hard and screaming for my dad. I felt shivers on my neck. Then, switched off. I just ran. I even dropped my bag and only realized I didn't have it anymore when I was in the car. I felt like my phone was my only way home. Things no longer felt real. It was like my legs were moving by themselves. I didn't know if the man was still following me. I could only hear my heart beating in my ears, and the bell. I finally heard my dad shout my name. I knew he was coming my way, and that he could see me because of the intonation in his voice. I pretty much lunged myself at him when we got closer. My dad heard the bell too. My mom could hear it on the phone. She was waiting with the car, ready to leave fast. My story takes place when I was about 13 years old. I'm 19 now if the details are unclear. I had just moved into a small countryside town, into a house that was just beside a huge forest. It was a new neighborhood and didn't really have much houses on my street. You could without a doubt walk hours into the woods and still be going. Being young and stupid, I'd take my dog walking without having my parents with me, or anything to protect me. I don't even remember taking a cell phone with me. Don't blame my parents, please. They were reassured by the fact that my dog was really big, and people were easily frightened by him. Really, extremely easily. My dog was about 7 at the time. I did that often. Nothing bad ever happened, and I had never met anyone out there. I really loved it, actually, because I could really take my mind off of everything else that was happening in my life. The moving was kinda rough on me, and to make everything more fun, I was bullied at school too, so I really needed this alone time. So, there I was, casually walking on a track that's across the wood, that's used if you have a motocross or a quad. A noise that at first I didn't pay too much attention to was coming from right behind me. It started to become slowly louder. When I turned back, I could see a person coming straight at me on his motorcycle. I'm a 13-year-old girl who's scared of just about everything that seems out of the ordinary. I decide to get off the track as quickly as I can and hide. Unfortunately for me, Henry is black and does not blend in with the surroundings, as everything was quite green and it was in the middle of the day as well. I walked pretty fast, but I could tell that the biker was getting closer, and I was pretty obvious. I started running and found a rock that was big enough to hide my dog and I behind. I heard the motocross come and go. It was impossible for the person to see us really. I waited, telling myself I was just being a little silly. When I thought I had waited long enough for him to be long gone, I started walking again. I froze instantly when I heard the loud engine becoming suddenly so close to me. Without hesitation, I started running like hell. When I was able to stop and hide, I did. My dog wasn't in the best shape, and I was feeling bad for making him run so much. I could tell that the biker was getting closer and closer to me. It wasn't an extremely dense forest, so he could still follow me on his bike, which meant he was so much faster than me. I'm a clumsy person. I trip on just about everything I can, so when I met this lovely branch, I fell on the ground pretty hard after tripping on it. I think I was so full of adrenaline, though, that I just got up and started running again. He was meters from me. He could see me, and was clearly chasing me. There was no doubt in my mind that if he got me, something really bad would happen. We were approaching a more dense part of the forest, so the guy had no choice but to stop his bike. It did give me an advantage on him, and I was able to get away from him. I was so glad when I saw a house come into view. It was under construction at the time, so nobody lived in it yet. I did find a hiding spot behind the fence. Minutes later, I saw the biker come close to me. I could tell he hadn't seen where I'd gone. I felt this huge relief when he started to go away. I think I hid for maybe another 30 or 40 minutes without moving to make sure he did not come back. I did find my way home and told my parents all about it, but they thought I was just being dramatic. In the end, I never knew who this person was. I did get hurt running through the forest, but nothing too serious. I heard years later that weed was being grown in a part of the woods, with cameras all around. Maybe I came too close to one of them, and they saw me on the cameras. I also went with friends of mine when I was older, and found a small abandoned house not too far from where this happened. So I live in the Pacific Northwest, which has a great number of excellent campsites. A favorite of mine isn't actually a designated campsite, but instead a forest road right on a river. Being a moody young woman, I would frequently make sojourns in my dumpy Toyota Camry to this one spot, just so I could be alone on the river and meditate on whatever might be bothering me. Camping alone as a 20-something female often inspired anxiety in both myself and my folks, but I didn't let that deter me. camping alone was something I genuinely enjoyed doing, and after experiencing a series of emotional misfortunes, I needed the time to myself. The last time I ever went to this particular spot, I must have been around 21 or so. I had just had a closure conversation with someone who broke my heart some months prior, and wanted to take some time to process that. Luckily enough, I had gotten consecutive days off from my retail job, so I packed up my car and made the 3-hour drive to the spot. This spot is fairly well known, and often a few other campers would be there on the weekends, but during the week it was more than likely to be empty. By the time I had arrived, it was late afternoon already. I was slightly disappointed to discover a turquoise Chevrolet truck and another silver car parked closest to the river. I parked some distance behind them and began to unload my things. 2 young gentlemen were hanging out by the truck, and as I passed by, they greeted me. I muttered a hello and kept on walking. I picked a spot I thought was nice and went back to get the rest of my things. As I was passing by their cars again, one of the men, the shorter, stockier one, rushed to a boulder near the path where some pistols were sitting and quickly concealed them. I learned later they were air pistols. He told me, sorry about that, I didn't mean to scare you. There was something childlike in his manner, like he did this specifically so I would pay attention to him. I told him it was fine, I wasn't scared, and kept walking. I unloaded the rest of my things and set up my camp and got a fire going. I was kind of tired after the long day of driving and hauling my stuff around, so I plopped down in a camp chair and got some chili mac cooking for dinner. It was a beautiful morning, not too hot, and golden hour on the river is always a fantastic thing, so I was thoroughly enjoying the moment. I could see the 2 men swimming upriver a bit, but it was easy enough to ignore them. By the time I'd finished eating, they passed by my camp on the opposite bank and were walking into the woods. I went down to the bank to get some water for my dishes when I heard the stockier one call out to me. Hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm a good guy, okay? Maybe this should have alarmed me more, but at the time it didn't. I definitely just thought the guy was socially inept, but left my judgments at that. I elected to answer with a polite and safe, okay. I just wanted him to leave me alone, and thought that if I was nice but uninterested, he would take the hint. This was a demonstrably ineffective approach. Some time had passed, and I had been musing over the last week's events and just generally enjoying the beauty around me, when the man came limping up to my camp. He was doing this feigned grunt as if he was in pain. I don't remember the exact exchange we had, but he wound up sitting at my camp and explaining to me that he had had some injuries in the past that were adversely impacted by the cold of the water. Before I go any further, I'll preface this by saying I was a pretty passive younger person, especially with strangers. I've definitely had to practice setting and maintaining boundaries as I've gotten older, and this instance demonstrates the danger of failing to do so. I kick myself every time I tell this story. I'm not sure if immediately telling this guy to piss off would have made him leave me alone, being a young, pretty girl alone in the woods, but I regret not speaking my mind more clearly that day. All that said, given some previous experiences, I had taken on a policy of engaging in active listening with others who seemed to be struggling. I've obviously faced my own woes and wanted to be treated compassionately, so I aimed my best to do the same with others. It was clear this guy was having issues, and by all exterior judgments seemed like he was down on his luck, even maybe with some maladaptive tendencies. He continued to stay at my camp and began telling me all about his life. These stories were pretty fantastical, the kind of lies a child would tell you of some incredible adventure or grandeur. As they continued to go on, they went into weirder and weirder territory. He explained that the aforementioned injuries that were paining him were the result of falling a great distance while on a welding job, where his hand was caught being impaled by a piece of rebar. He described his heroic efforts of self-preservation by unhooking himself from the rebar and falling the rest of the distance, breaking his legs or something like that. I just gave him a series of, yeah. Oh wow, that must have been painful. He revealed that he was recently homeless after splitting up with his girlfriend, who had been talking to another guy. That's why he was staying here in his truck, the aforementioned Chevy. He also told me he DJ'd a joint in the closest town and made a lot of money doing it. He kept increasing his exaggerations, telling me he was also a 5-star chef, and enlightened me on a gross-sounding dish of his own creation, essentially a soup made from watered-down fruit jelly and some other sweet things. He also told me he had once been a Navy SEAL specializing in small arms. It was then when he revealed to me that the pistols he'd thought scared me before were air pistols, and augmented his tale of being in special forces by demonstrating some twirls with one of them and showing me what ultimately turned out to be some really mediocre marksmanship. At a later point, he even wound up giving me one of them because it made him think of doing bad things. I hesitantly accepted it. I was pretty sketched out by this point and wanted the man to leave me alone, but lacked the backbone to tell him to just go away. Unfortunately, as the evening wore on, he continued to get weirder and weirder. By this point, he had been bringing his belongings from his truck and setting them up around my camp. This was a process that happened gradually, each new conversation note eliciting a new show-and-tell idea. I can't remember all the things he brought down. It included his guitar and a lot of other stuff. He even tried to give me some of it, but after the air pistol, I declined. The conversation dragged on, eventually with him telling me in detail about some of his childhood traumas. His father, who had been in the military, was very strict and often beat him. His cousin, who had sexually abused him severe enough to leave scars in certain areas, which he described to me in detail. He got really close to me when he told me this, looked me square in the eye unblinking, and said, "And that's why I'd never hurt you." He stared at me the whole time. I shit you not, my skin started to crawl. I had a few things to defend myself with, a hunting knife and some bear spray, but he hadn't done anything directly threatening yet. Not long after this, his ex-girlfriend showed up. He introduced me as his friend, and they talked a little bit before he kind of ignored her in favor of me. The whole thing just made me even more uncomfortable. She didn't stay long, and sped away in her truck. I'm assuming maybe in some fit of jealousy. What did I do to deserve that? I didn't say anything other than that I was going to bed, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. He said he needed some alone time himself, and I thought I had lucked out. I went into my tent to put down bed for the night, as it had gotten quite dark, only to discover that a cheap ring had been left on my pillow. He must have placed it there when I went to step away to go to the bathroom or something. Furthermore, I could hear him wandering around my campsite. I peeked out of my tent. He had his head in his hands as he paced and started muttering to himself. A powerful feeling of needing to flee suddenly came over me. There was no way I could stay there, even if he didn't do anything to hurt me. At minimum, he would annoy me for the whole 3 days I planned to stay. Immediately, I started packing up my stuff. Then he asked what I was doing. I told him I was just going to go. Since I was car camping, I had a bit of stuff with me that would require a few trips. I hurried to get it all to my car. One trip of the path to the parking area, he stood in the middle of the path complaining that my flashlight was blinding him. I didn't say anything and ran around him. Most of my trips after that were unbothered, although I went with one arm free so I could carry my hunting knife and be ready, in case he tried to get physical with me. On my second to last trip down, he came out of the dark from the direction of his truck. He was sobbing and crying. But I didn't do anything wrong. I flat out ignored him and ventured down the path once more to grab what I could, and hightailed it to my car. I wound up leaving a cord of wood behind, not seeing it worth the danger to go back for it. I shut all my doors and hopped in, absolutely elated at the sound of my 30-year-old car starting up. I got the hell out of there and drove the whole 3 hours back to my house. I didn't have reception until about halfway through the drive, during which point I called my mom and told her what happened. She was upset that I didn't tell her where I was going, and that she was glad I was okay. When I got back, my stepmother asked what I was doing back so soon. I explained what happened all over again. My dad suggested I get a gun if I wanted to continue this solo camping, in case something like that happened again. The next day, I went out to my car so I could drive to meet some friends, and found my tire had gone flat. What an immense stroke of luck that it didn't happen at the campsite, or somewhere else in the mountains where I didn't have reception. I'm in my mid-20s now and moved to the city about 6 months ago. My roommate and best friend discovered the air pistol while he was helping me move. He knew I didn't own any guns and was immediately confused, thinking it was real. When he asked me about it, I had a little laugh and explained this whole story. I haven't been back to that site since, and while I'd definitely bring a friend there, I probably won't go alone ever again. Years ago, man am I old, but let's say mid-1990s, I worked as a woodland firefighter in the Army Reserves. I worked as a spotter. Basically, I was stationed in a giant fire tower in the middle of a national park. My job was just as it sounds. I would use binoculars and look out for fire, smoke, other telltale signs of a flame. My nearest compadre was 5 miles or so from me. My days consisted of working my shift, taking long walks around the fire tower, being on the lookout for anyone who might be having illegal fires, looking out for wildlife, and staying afoot of bears and wolves. The way our shifts worked back then was 1 week on, 1 week off. We slept in the towers, cooked our food, did everything there. There were nearby showers and toilets too. Well, one day I came across an illegal bear trap. I had several ranger friends, and I safely set off the trap, then picked it up to take to the ranger station on one of my treks out for food in my Jeep. Poaching is illegal in the park and carried a big fine, even back then. Some jail time as well, but that never stopped the poachers from trying. I heard rifle shots and headed back from my fire tower. We did have a rifle there, to be used in case of emergencies. Just a few months back, a fellow spotter had been mauled to death by a grizzly, so each tower had been outfitted with a rifle. I looked with my binoculars but could not see anything out of the ordinary. I radioed my coworker Ben, an older guy in the adjacent tower. He said he hadn't heard anything today, but had come across quite a few traps himself. That night, after a dinner of franken beans and toast, I was writing to my future wife when I heard the rumbling of a truck. Thinking it may be Ben, occasionally he made the trek over. We would crack open a soda and chew the fat for a bit. Instead, I saw 4 men with rifles emerge from the truck. One looked around and leaped up against it, while the other 3 grabbed traps and began to set them up. I grabbed the rifle and my lantern and headed down the stairs. I was only 21, a farmer's son from a rural Virginia farming town, and even with 1 deployment behind me, I was naive. I should have called it in to the Rangers, but instead I thought I could talk some sense into the 4 dangerous men. I barely managed to get out a, "Hey, what are you doing?" before I was roughly shoved. My lantern fell and I heard it crack. My rifle was kicked away from me, and I felt the breath leave my chest when I was violently kicked in the stomach. I had barely caught my breath when I was grabbed by 2 of the men and shoved forward into the woods. It seemed like we walked for miles, but in reality it was probably only a single one. I did notice that there were no sounds. The forest is very rarely silent. It's a cacophony of sounds even at night. Owls, wolves, crickets. But on this night, nothing. Suddenly I was shoved onto my knees, and I felt hot tears welling up. I thought of my parents, my little sister, my brother and my fiancé were back home in Virginia. I heard the rack of a gun. I shut my eyes and prayed. Suddenly, the quiet night erupted with noise. It was the sound of sirens, those of the forest rangers, and behind them in his pickup, Ben, who had tried to radio me that he had heard a car's engine and came to my tower when I didn't reply. The poachers were immediately arrested. Ben drove me back to the tower as I was still shaking. He didn't lay into me for not following procedure. He just looked over at me and said, "That was close, kid." I ended up leaving the job months later to take a job closer to home, but I never ran into any more poachers during the rest of my time. I kept in contact with Ben for a while, sent him a wedding invite and then a photo of my firstborn son in 1997. As time usually goes, however, we lost track of one another. A few years back, I Googled him. He would have been 75 or so. I discovered he passed away a few years back. I don't know whatever came of those poachers, but I know I never want to meet them again. Hello, I'm French, so I apologize if I make any mistakes in advance. As I just told you, I live in France. This story happened to me this summer, just after the lockdown ended. I am and was 19 at the time. After the lockdown ended, I went to my grandparents' house to spend a few weeks. I got tested before this, so no problems there. My grandparents live in a small city in the north of France. They have a dog who's quite big. When I was really young, I lived at my grandparents' for about a year. At that time, the dog was only a puppy. Her name is Chippy, in French, which kinda means little devil in English, but in a more affectionate way. Considering that when I was living there, I played with her quite a lot. We are both really close, and this will have its importance later. Two of my favorite hobbies are having long walks and running. Thus, every evening, I was going out for a long walk with that dog. There's a track that follows a path through the forest. Then there's a small hill, and on top of that, a big place with a lot of fields there. I run there a lot, so I know the place quite well. The air is fresh, and the view is very beautiful. I was going there with the dog almost every day. It was also helping my grandparents, having her do a lot of exercise and get some of the energy out. The first time we went there, nothing too special happened. We just enjoyed our walk. It's about 6 to 7 kilometers, so basically an hour-long walk. The next day, when we arrived on top of the hill, in the field, it was probably around 10 p.m., but there was still some light because it was summer. There were 3 other persons walking. They were younger than me, probably about 15 or 16. I also noticed they were smoking. My guess was that they used to come here so they wouldn't be seen by their parents. We walked past them, I greeted them politely, and they greeted me back. Once again, nothing special there. For a whole week, I did this walk at around the same time, 10 p.m., and passed those 3 guys with nothing special happening. It was perfectly fine to me this way. The second week, as usual, I went for the walk with Chippy. We arrived at the fields. There was only one of those 3 boys. He wasn't smoking this time, though. When he saw me, I was at the entrance of the field just after the little hill climb, so the entrance of the forest was just behind me. He did a sign with his hand to catch my attention and asked me if I had a lighter. I actually did have one in my pocket. I told him, yeah, sure. He walked over to me, his hands in the pockets of his hoodie. As he came closer, for some reason I felt a shiver run through my body. It's crazy how sometimes your instinct just knows there's a problem, but you don't listen to it because nothing looks weird to you. I handed over the lighter when he passed by. At that moment, my dog was staring intently right at him. Everything suddenly happened really fast. He did a fast hand movement, with his hand emerging from the hoodie. I only saw something shining. I just had a reflex of throwing myself back, so hard that I actually fell down. I realized that it was a knife he was holding, and he had just tried to stab me. What saved me is my dog, God bless her. When she saw the man was trying to stab me, she jumped on him and he fell down. I immediately got up to my feet and heard something behind my back. From the entrance of the forest, I saw 2 men wearing animal masks running toward me. They were probably the 2 friends from before. In this moment, your brain just acts by itself. You don't think at all. In this case, the answer it found was really simple. The other guy was still on the ground. I just watched my dog and told her, "Run!" I started running and she took off after me. I heard the worst possible thing from the guy who had just gotten up. "Catch him. Don't let him get away." At this moment, I was totally terrified. I was just running and running. I could hear them sprinting behind me. I was only thinking to myself, how long will they follow me? Who the hell are these guys? This was the first time I was really happy to be a runner. I was clearly better than those guys, and that totally saved me. They chased me for what felt like an eternity. Fortunately, at the end of the field, there's another entrance to the forest. This time, it's a descent with the road at the end. I heard the steps of the 3 men vanishing as I arrived at the end of the forest. I didn't stop running, though, until I arrived at my grandparents' house and locked myself in. I took a second to catch a big breath and gave a huge hug to my dog. I saw in her eyes that she totally understood what happened. I've never been so happy to have her in my life. After that, I told everything to my grandparents. We called the police, but they didn't find anyone. I don't know what these guys wanted, but the animal masks really made me think about some kind of Satanists. I really don't want to know either way. I do still enjoy long walks with Chippy, my hero dog, but now I go out earlier, into places with a little more people around. Hey folks, I'm kinda new and this is the first story I've submitted here. Anyway, let's get started. I must clarify that this did not only happen to me, but my uncle as well. This was right after a Christmas Eve party, when everyone had gone home. I decided to stay because my cousin and I were still watching a movie. My uncle, who used to walk his dogs into the woods next to a park, went off to take them out for the night. Before he decided to do this, my aunt had pleaded with him not to do that, because it was already too dark out. It was around 4 or 5 a.m. He never cared much for that sort of thing, though. He went off anyway. My aunt was really worried, so she sent me to go along with him. Once we started out, nothing wrong seemed to happen. Everything was perfectly quiet. My uncle and his dogs were having a very relaxing walk as usual. I wasn't really paying too much attention to the surroundings, but suddenly, the dogs went completely still. This wasn't that strange. They always stopped on their way to stare and bark at other animals they noticed, like rats, birds, insects, or other dogs. This time was different, though. When the dogs got still, my uncle and I noticed that something was very wrong. The dogs weren't angry or curious. They looked kind of nervous, anxious, afraid. One of the dogs, the largest one, was growling and shaking. As my uncle started to get worried about the situation, we heard it. People in the woods. We didn't see how many because of the darkness. We could hear them saying something.
We all gather here by the blood of incomprehensible.
As me and my uncle began to hear that, he yelled for his dogs to follow him out of the woods. We all left. As we did, he turned his head back and saw a slight movement of branches and shrubs. Perhaps because these people were now trying to hide. After all that happened, he decided to never walk his dogs near those woods again, nor when it got dark out either. Hi everyone. My story is long, but I feel like the details are important to understand just how creepy this actually was. So this creepy encounter happened about 10 years ago, when I was 17 or so. I'm a female, by the way. I was taking a course in Tamarindo, Costa Rica. I'm originally from Canada. It's important to note that before being sent to Costa Rica to take a month-long language course, not only was I a wild, irresponsible teenager with no regard for my own safety, but I was also dabbling in some recreational substances. Cocaine, MDMA, K, whatever was given to me really. By the time I was sent to Costa Rica, I had a pretty serious drug problem. Anyway, so I had been staying in CR for about 3 weeks at the time. I was supposed to be going to class daily, which I did not do. I spent most of my days instead sleeping off hangovers, and every night was spent with my friends from school at the local clubs on the main strip in Tamarindo. The clubs there closed down anywhere between 3 to 6 a.m. We, my friends and I, would usually head down to the 24-hour bar on the beach after the clubs closed. This 24-hour beach bar would be packed with tourists and locals, all pouring out of the clubs and out onto the beach to continue drinking. And there is where my story starts. It was probably around 4 a.m. The club I was at had closed down, so I made my way to the beach bar with groups of people. Most of them I didn't know at all. I was already pretty damn drunk, just chatting with people and having a good time. The drinks were still flowing, and I felt safe enough. Eventually, a local man, probably in his mid-30s, sparked a conversation with me. We chatted as best we could, but he didn't speak very much English, and I didn't speak a lick of Spanish. Eventually, he asked me if I did cocaine, which I replied, yes, I did. He took a baggie of coke out and began feeding me sniffs with a plastic card. I must have done about 10 to 15 bumps. As soon as I'd sniffed one, he'd be preparing another. Keep in mind, at the time, I was a very petite 17-year-old girl weighing about 95 pounds. I must have just looked completely out of it, because then a friend from my school approached me and told me he wanted to make sure I got home okay. I remember thanking that local coke man and saying I was going to leave. Even though I was out of it, I could sense he was very angry that I was being taken away. He said goodbye though and let me leave with my friend. To get back to our school from the beach, you have to walk 10 minutes on a dirt path through this dense forest, like you're walking in a Costa Rican jungle in pitch black at night. No lights at all. My friend and I are there, walking through this jungle back to my school. I'm completely out of my mind coked up, and I couldn't even walk anymore. I spotted a small clearing in the trees, and told him I had to stop and lay down for a bit. We spent about 20 minutes laying in the bush clearing, staring up at the tops of the trees, listening to the leaves brush against one another, the morning birds singing their songs. I could see the sun was coming up just now. Finally, when my coke buzz began to die down, we got back up and continued through the forest toward the school. Walked another 10 minutes and we had finally arrived at the back entrance of our gated school. We used the key fob to get in, then closed the back gate which automatically locked behind us. My friend and I sat on a ledge near the back door and talked for another 15 minutes until he decided to go up to his room for the night. I decided to lay myself into a hammock to finally fall asleep outside. The hammock I was laying on was right near the back door, maybe about 20 feet or so away. I remember closing my eyes and feeling myself fall deep asleep, and then I heard it. A tapping on the fence of the back gate. I lifted my head up from the hammock and was completely surprised. It was that coke man, the local guy from the 24-hour beach bar. He had caught me completely off guard. My mind was racing. I couldn't understand why he was all the way at my school now. Being the naive teenager that I was, I smiled and shook my head no at him politely. I think I rattled off something about being tired. He motioned for me to unlock the back door and kept waving me over. I had this terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach. I smiled politely and again told him I was too tired. Through the fence, he took a baggie of coke out of his pocket and showed it to me, waving me over. Now remember, I was a 17-year-old idiot who didn't care about life. When I saw that coke bag, I slowly got myself up out of the hammock and walked over to the coke man. I laughed thinking about it now. He kept trying to coax me to come out and sit with him. After barely any persuasion, I decided to unlock the gate slowly. Just for a minute, I told him. I remember seeing this complete excitement in his eyes when I clicked open the lock. I opened the gate and stepped out of the school grounds, sitting on a rock beside him. I remember as soon as the gate closed behind me and I sat down, he immediately started feeding me more lines, until I couldn't even see straight. I remember not being able to move my legs, and feeling very weak. It probably wasn't even coke. I have to go now, I told him, barely being able to form the words. He became aggressive. He grabbed my arm, begging me, "Please stay, I have a present for you." I could sense his desperation, and I was finally starting to feel like I was in danger. The desperation in his eyes was something I still feel when I think back on it. We were both standing up now, and he was gripping my arm so hard. I remember his hands were cold even though we were in a tropical forest. It was so weird. Anyway, out of nowhere, the school security guard burst through the back door. "Hey, what's going on here? Are you okay?" The coke man immediately let me go, and I hopped back into the school grounds. The security guard closed the door. I could see the man running back through the forest where he'd come from. In the moment, I didn't realize, but now I know that the coke man had not only started following us when we left the beach bar, but he hid somewhere and waited while my friend and I laid on the ground for 20 minutes. When we started making our way to the school again, He followed us all the way back to the school grounds. Then he waited another 15 minutes hiding, watching for my friend to leave, until I was completely alone. I don't know what he had planned for me, but I'm grateful that the school security guard came right at the right time. Okay, so this happened to me earlier, and I don't think I'll be sleeping tonight. I'm currently staying in a remote part of the United Kingdom and having a bit of a break from working, which means more time to pursue my hobbies. One of those hobbies being photography. I had scoped out a creepy-looking tree formation in a nearby forest and set my camera and tripod up as the sun was coming down, for that extra creepy vibe. As I was there happily taking photos, I see a woman pass the entrance to the arched trees. This woman had parked her car next to mine when I arrived. She went past a couple of times, looking at me for prolonged periods with each time she passed by. I assumed she wanted to come up this path but saw I was taking photos, so she just decided to walk elsewhere. Approximately 5 minutes go by, and she appears again, this time walking towards me, dragging her left side slightly with this strange limp. She stops once and stares at me for a few seconds, then starts walking toward me again. I called out to her and asked if she was okay. I was starting to put my camera away at this point, and readying my tripod to use for self-defense if necessary, because the vibe I was getting from her was way off. She started doing these weird grunts at me, then stopped and stared again. It was at this point that this woman was close enough for me to realize that she was actually a man in woman's clothing, with a wig as well. An uncomfortable moment passed. She started grunting again, walking toward the edge of the path. She grabbed a pile of leaves and started tossing them around, grunting some more, then walked off aimlessly into the forest. I called my friend to tell her about this weird experience that just happened, and asked that she stayed on the phone with me, just in case this person came back. I was just going to take a couple of more photos, then I was out. For a good 10 minutes or so, I could hear the crunching of leaves circling me in the forest. I convinced myself it was just the wildlife. After a while, though, there was silence. I start taking the photos. I hadn't seen or heard the person for around 15 minutes now, so I assumed I was safe. I leave the path and see that the car is gone. Thank fuck. I very quickly notice, though, that now there's a man walking toward me from the entrance. I take note that it's the same fucking guy. He had changed into men's attire. As he walks past me, he shoots me this grin that sends shivers down my spine. I don't scare easily, but this guy just gave off all the wrong signals, causing this overwhelming feeling of dread to wash over me. I'm still on the phone at this point, holding my tripod over my shoulder just in case. I quickened my pace and got back into my car. As I did so, I saw him come out of the lane I had been down, stop and look around, then start walking toward my car with intent. I videoed him walking toward me, then hauled the fuck out of there, driving past his car that he had moved and hidden down the road, thinking to myself, what in the gray beard fuck just happened? This happened about 5 or 6 years ago. My friends and I were freshmen in high school. We frequently went into the woods near our school that had some abandoned structures. Sometimes we went in there to smoke, graffiti, or just otherwise explore. It was always a pretty fun time. On a fall day after school, we decided to go exploring in the woods like we usually did. For the first 10 or 15 minutes into our adventure, everything was fairly normal. Eventually, we came across a tree that had a dagger sticking out of it. Immediately, I got this horrible feeling. One of my friends, Nathan, went over to the tree and took the dagger out. Sure enough, it was 100% real. I'm not exactly sure what I was hoping for. I guess I was hoping that it was some sort of gag toy or something. We all just kinda looked at each other a little weirded out, but didn't think too much of it. Maybe someone left it in there before we came to mess with whoever came across it or something. That's what we were hoping for, at least. Nathan put the dagger into his backpack, and we continued on with our adventure. It wasn't long after we came across this tree, though, that things started to get a bit weird. I was the first of us to notice it. There was a man in all black trailing us, keeping a good distance away. He was always off to the right of us, hiding behind some tree or bush. From what I could see, he looked to be an average-height man wearing a black hoodie, black jeans, and black boots. I wanted to leave the second I saw him, but when I told my friends what I had seen, I don't think any of them believed me. They just kinda laughed me off. Either they thought I was just seeing things, or they thought someone was just messing with us and didn't feel very threatened by it. By the time we were about 40 minutes into the woods, they finally saw him. This time he was a lot closer though, maybe about 30 or so feet away from us. I couldn't make out much detail about his face, because he had his hood on and his head down. I could see he was wearing some sort of white t-shirt underneath his hoodie though. Everyone froze for a brief moment. There were 4 of us all together. We just stared, not really sure what to do in this sort of situation. Everyone stood in silence for 3 very long, very scary seconds, until he ran further back into the woods behind some trees, and we could no longer see him. I grabbed onto Nathan's arm, who was the closest to me, and whispered, "We have to go now." I just had this horrible pit in my stomach. At first, we made our way back to the entrance of the woods at a jogging pace. I think we were all trying to downplay this experience in our minds, to not invoke pure fear and panic. We kept at that pace for a minute or two, until we heard leaves crunching and sticks breaking right behind us. We turned around, and there he was trailing us. We start running, and he starts chasing after us. I was the one behind the group, so the man was closest to me. I could hear his heavy breathing in my ears. That's how close he was to me, just an arm's length away. We picked up our speed. I thought for sure I was going to pass out because I was fairly out of shape, but luckily we made it out in about 25 minutes. Stopping once or twice to catch our breath when we were sure the man wasn't in sight. Once we all got out, we just kind of looked at each other, trying to figure out what the fuck just happened. We didn't talk about much after that. I don't think any of us wanted to think about it for too long. Looking back on it now, we probably should have reported it to the police in case the man tried to hurt any other innocent kids going into those woods. I don't know if it was him that placed that dagger in the tree or why it was there. Honestly, I don't think I want to know about it. I don't know why he was there or what his intentions were. I'm just glad we got away, and I hope he hasn't hurt or tried to hurt anyone since. So to the man who followed and chased my friends and I in the woods, let's not meet again. This happened to my roommate and I 2 years ago, when we drove into the national forest just outside of the town we live in. We go to a small college in New England, about 3 hours away from any major city. For context, this forest has quite a few urban legends surrounding it, and the local community, although they do go there often, have a lot of superstitions about how to be safe whilst there. I had just broken up with my partner, and my roommate could sense I was really feeling down. Finals were just around the corner, so she decided to help me get my mind off of things. She suggested we go to a nice spot she had found just last week, and just chill out and de-stress. We took a couple of beers with us, and drove to this secluded spot in the forest. From the moment we left the main asphalt road in the forest, I saw a couple of things that immediately unsettled me. You could see the abandoned houses of a ghost town from the higher ground the road was on. I saw this old doll hanging from a rope on a tree. Some creepy shit for sure, but we really didn't give it a second thought and just continued driving. We got to a clearing and parked our car behind some trees, popped open the back of our SUV, and just started chatting and playing some music. About 10 minutes into this, 2 cars appeared from the road and parked in the clearing as well. My friend didn't pay them any attention. Instead, she just kept talking. But as I was facing them from where I sat, I couldn't stop myself from seeing what they did. I saw a guy pop out of each car, talk for a few minutes. Then I saw them take out this long object covered in a dark plastic bag from the back of one of the cars. This is when I noticed these guys had guns. Not like shotguns, which you see often in this type of town, but handguns. They started lighting the bag on fire. I told my friend to get down. She turned around and saw them for the first time. Black, thick smoke was rising from the bag, and between trying to keep my head down and steal glances at them, I saw them take out a second object. I heard them shoot at it, right before they set that on fire too. I don't know how long my friend and I were lying there in silence, but it was definitely enough to let the terror sink in and whisper to each other how much we loved each other, just in case this was what we thought it was. At some point, I dared to look up and saw they were pointing at our car. We saw them walking into the woods, maybe trying to follow our tracks or look for us. All I know is that right then, I told my friend to hop into the driver's seat and make a run for it. I shut the back door, and between that and the car starting up, the guys heard it and started running right towards us. Then they ran towards one of their cars and hopped in. We drove over a hill, and driving way above what was safe for dirt roads on a hillside, we lost them. We drove to a neighboring town and roamed around for a while, just to make sure no one was following us, before we went back to our dorm. That day we tried to make fun of the whole situation, and got really drunk before finally breaking down and crying from knowing we had seen something we were not supposed to. We were at first terrified of telling anyone, but we did eventually tell officers on campus, who contacted the police for us. They never found anything in the end, though. I wasn't entirely sure about sharing this story. It gives me shivers every time I remember what happened. This happened in the Amazonas, in the border between Brazil and Peru. The jungle, it's an amazing place to live. Everyone knew each other, and I had a big group of friends of different ages. The only horrible part about the Amazon is the existence of terrorist groups that try to control the region. I was 7 when this happened. Every kid in the village knew we had freedom to go anywhere, as long as it was not close to the terrorists, and that we could never leave the village at night. My parents taught me, since I was very little, how to hide just in case something happened, and to run if I saw things will get dangerous. I remember all the adults of the village were celebrating something. I think it was an Amazonian party like Halloween. I remember my mother painting her face in a tribal way. All the children went together to a house to stay safe and have fun. The eldest girl was in charge. She was 17, and as soon as our parents left, she ignored us and left with her friends. Our closest group consisted of 6 children. I was the youngest one, and we all listened to the most adventurous one there, Leon, who was 14. Whatever Leon said, we followed, because he was fun, always making challenges, and he knew how to take care of us. Yes, despite him being quite reckless, he was our good friend. We loved him, and knew he would never abandon us if something bad happened. After playing soccer for a while and eating, the 6 of us became quite bored. Carla, one of the 6, had the idea to dress up like our parents did, with tribal makeup and dresses. We agreed, and soon we were all dressed up like the kids who lived in the village of the deepest parts of the Amazon. I remember us all playing around and having a lot of fun, until Leon said, and I quote, "Let's go explore the Amazon and find a hidden treasure." We all cheered and agreed to leave. It was easy enough to escape since the girl who was supposed to take care of us had already left. Leon managed to find a lantern and a boat big enough for us 6. We decided to set sail. It was around midnight, but we didn't care too much. Just imagine 6 kids dressed up on a boat, splashing water everywhere, trying to find this imaginary treasure. No phones, no adults, just the jungle and us. It was life at its purest. Everything seemed to be going perfectly, until we suddenly heard someone calling out, "Who's there?" We saw this lighted boat approaching. Quickly, Leon dropped the lantern and instructed us to lay down on the boat's floor and stay very still. It was one of the scariest moments of my life. I remember very clearly how we were all with our bellies on the floor, grabbing our hands and not even daring to breathe. But it was already too late. "Stop hiding. I see you," a voice said, as the man illuminated our boat. We stood up and saw 4 men with rifles pointing at us. They laughed and said, "Look, it's a bunch of children." Leon put himself in front of us defensively and said we were on a hurry because our parents were expecting us home soon. The biggest man, who was wearing a red bandana, laughed and said, "Little kids shouldn't be alone here at night. You could disappear here in the jungle and no one would ever find you." At this point, I was super scared, and Carla started crying. "You can go. You're just tribe babies." Then they left. I remember all of us hugging each other, crying and sailing as fast as we could out of there. Once we got home, we entered the house and closed all the doors and windows. We slept together on the floor, but before that, we agreed not to tell this to anyone in the village, not the elders or our parents. Even now, no one knows what happened that night. Years later, I understood why they let us go. They thought we were kids from that local tribe we dressed up as. We had no value to them. If they had known we were just dressed up and we were actually from the village, I probably wouldn't be here typing this story.
Portis Media.
Good evening all, and welcome. I've got a huge announcement. I had the absolute pleasure to work with the channel Dark Echoes. They are an absolutely amazing channel that produce live action horror stories. It is some serious hard work and incredibly well produced. I'm so glad that I had the privilege to work with them. The first story in tonight's video is completely live action, and instead of listening, I would really appreciate it if you could watch it. Of course, it's being narrated by me. It's really good, really dark. I'm sure all of you will love it. And it's a let's not meet kind of story. So please check them out at the end of the video. Their links are all in the description, and a link to their channel and another of their videos will be at the end. So please show them some love. Let them know you came from Mort, and enjoy. But for now, get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This is my dark confession. I guess I'm what you'd call the black sheep of my family. I've always had interests and pursuits that weren't aligned with my family. They were religious. I was agnostic. They were family-oriented. I was a loner. They went to college and became professionals. I flunked out and fantasized about starting a metal cover band I'd call 9 Inch Nihilism. When I was 27, my girlfriend dumped me, and I moved back home. During my season of failure, there was a lot of tension with my parents. My melancholy attitude and refusal to get a job weren't doing me any favors. Things seemed on the verge of boiling over. And then, something happened that changed all of that. My uncle got into a serious car accident that left him in a coma, hovering on the verge of death. My mum and this uncle were extremely close, and she was devastated. She dragged me to the hospital, and we basically moved into his private room. Other relatives came and went, including his wife, who went home each night. But Mum and I were there nearly around the clock. For 3 days, I endured the drudgery of waiting for someone I didn't even like to slowly die. But then he surprised us all and pulled through. My mother was elated. The emotional floodgates opened, and she cried awkwardly in my arms. When he was cleared for visitors, my mother wanted to see him right away, but a nurse informed her he already had a private visitation in progress with his legal counsel, and that they'd let her know when it was finished. An hour later, the same nurse came into our visitors area and informed us that my uncle had requested to speak with me privately. I don't know who was more surprised, my mother or me. A little backstory here. My uncle and I have zero relationship. The few interactions we have had were generally adversarial. He was the most hoity-toity of all my relatives, a paragon of the Christian rights family values, Mr. Faith, Family and Community. He was a multi-millionaire success story, and I was a loser he looked down upon my entire life. We had nothing in common whatsoever. At least, that's what I thought when I entered the hospital room. My uncle looked like he was a single held breath away from death, but he was surprisingly lucid. He acknowledged our past differences, and essentially owned up to being an arrogant blowhard for my entire childhood. He then paused for a long, pensive moment, like he was having second thoughts about what he was going to say, and then he began. He explained that he would have to remain in the hospital for a few more weeks. He still had several more surgeries scheduled, and there was a considerable chance he might die in the process. He then looked me dead in the eyes and told me he needed me to take care of something for him, something delicate. I knew whatever he said next was going to be fascinating, and he did not disappoint. He explained that he had a secret property upstate managed by one of his shell companies that nobody knew about. Inside, he had something that would damage his legacy if it were discovered. He wanted me to remove it from the premises and dispose of it, and he was willing to handsomely compensate me for my effort and discretion. I won't bore you with the legal specifics, but essentially he arranged with his lawyers the following: upfront money to cover my expenses, an immediate payout of $50,000 upon providing proof of completion, and a trust to ensure that I took his secret to the grave, to the tune of $50,000 a year for the rest of my life. Needless to say, I accepted his offer. I walked out of the room and told my mum I had a friend from school that needed some emergency help, and started driving north. Back in the hospital room, before my uncle told me exactly what he wanted removed, my mind raced with the possibility of what it might be. Proof of a crime? A snuff tape? Evidence that he was in the clan? The reality was just as dark as any of those. I arrived at the nondescript house in the country. I expected something menacing and brooding, but this property would be best described as quaint. I entered with the provided key and went straight to the thick metal door with a protected glass window. As I peered through, my opinion of my uncle would never be the same again. Sitting there, alone, hungry, thirsty, and likely scared out of her mind, was a young woman. Now I realized the moral thing to do would have been to immediately contact the authorities and to ensure my uncle was exposed as the monster he truly is. But like I said, this is a confession, and it was easier than you might expect for me to rationalize my decision to follow through with removing her as my uncle requested. And not just because of the money, although that was most of it. There was also my mum. It would destroy her to know the truth. She would never recover. My uncle's instructions were very specific, and I followed them to the letter. I fed her, gave her a fresh change of clothes, and then gave her a drugged bottle of water. After she was incapacitated, I removed any evidence of her restraint system and then loaded her limp body into the van. It was an 8-hour drive to my destination, during which I crossed 3 state lines and became a human trafficker. At one point, she started to wake up. I assured her I wasn't going to hurt her, and she was going to start a new life, and that she would never go back to that other place. I gave her more food and water, non-drugged this time, and after she started to relax a bit, she opened up and told me her story. She was 15 when she was abducted and eventually sold to my uncle. It happened at a shopping center in Reykjavik, Iceland. She was in a parking lot waiting for a friend. It happened so fast, she didn't even scream. The last public place she ever visited was a candle store. I gave her one more bottle of drugged water as we neared the destination. It was a rundown motel outside a major city, the kind that accepts cash and was littered with junkies. I carried the girl inside and set her on the bed. There was a distinctive painting on the wall above her, and I positioned myself so that both the girl and the painting were in frame and took the photo. This was the proof requested by my uncle, to ensure that I had taken her to the correct place. As she lay there, I was captivated by her unique beauty, her blue eyes, her pale skin. I took out the syringe. It contained a lethal dose of fentanyl-laced heroin. He wanted me to leave her for dead in the hotel room and make it look like another downtrodden soul threw her life away. A few minutes later, my new account showed $50,000. I left the hotel and drove straight back to my home state. By this point, I hadn't slept in over 24 hours, but I drove through the night fueled on fear and adrenaline. It was morning by the time I arrived, but I didn't go home. I met with a realtor about buying an isolated farmhouse with a large, unfinished basement. It was done. I would never go back to being who I was only a day before. I felt weird about it for a few weeks, but then my life recalibrated, and this became my new baseline. That was 3 years ago. My uncle ended up pulling through several surgeries, and a few months later, he left the hospital. As for me, it's nice having my own place, and somewhat surprisingly, I actually visit my family more than I expected. Don't get me wrong, I'm still the black sheep. They're still religious, I'm still agnostic, and they're still family-oriented. And I'm still, well, I'm not really sure what I am. I just know that I don't have a lot in common with them. Except my uncle. We do have this one thing, and I don't mean first-hand knowledge of his darkest secret. No, I mean something else. I have my own secret now, something no one else would quite understand. See, I didn't inject the girl with fentanyl. I took her with me, and I've kept her contained in my now finished basement ever since. Like I said, this is my dark confession. We all have our secrets. My name is Lily. At the time of writing this, I'm a 20-year-old woman who lives with my boyfriend Ben and our 3 cats. We live in a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment on the 3rd floor, right next to the outside stairs, and can very easily hear anyone walking up or entering the apartments around us. Our room is right beside the front door, and the window looks out onto the wooden stairs/deck area. A little background/context. A little less than a year ago, I had a stalker. I met him on a popular BDSM site and made it very clear to him from the beginning that I wasn't interested in anything serious, strictly a friends with benefits type of relationship. He was a little odd, and admitted to me he had autism, but I didn't care. I had plenty of friends growing up, and currently who were on the spectrum, and were still functioning members of society, as most are. I hung out with him frequently because of the sex, but also because I was 19 and he would buy me booze with my money. I worked 2 jobs during this time, one retail and one food service. People at my retail job knew him and suggested very heavily to me prior that he wasn't a great person and to be careful. I started distancing myself from him when he began talking about his severe mental illness, specifically his predisposition to schizophrenia. I told him he needed to seek medical attention if he thought something was wrong and tried supporting him. I tried backing away completely when he admitted to me he had dreams of murdering me and my parents' dog, murdering him and having flashbacks to Auschwitz where he killed children in a past life. Lovely. I immediately cut contact with him, but made sure to record calls and voicemails. When telling my retail co-workers about this, they told me that the behavior was not new. Ben and I had just begun seeing each other at this point, but he, as well as my parents, strongly encouraged that I file the restraining order. I told them that I would think it over, but it was solidified when he showed up to my place of work just to get food. I hid in the back of the restaurant and told my shift leader I couldn't go out there until he was gone. I could tell he was skeptical, but I said it was fine as long as I stayed busy in the back. I called Ben while back there to inform him of what was going on, and after heading up, resumed my job. Ben showed up minutes after and made it very clear to my stalker that I didn't want to see him, but did not threaten him. My shift leader later told me that while making my stalker's meal, he looked 2 co-workers in the eyes and said, "I know Lily is in the back hiding from me." My uncle is a retired lawyer, and therefore helped me take proper action against him. My stalker's lawyer and my uncle worked together frequently before my uncle retired, and struck a deal with my attorney and uncle that if we dropped the charges, he would put the fear of God in him. After all of this, I have yet to see him again 6 months later. Ben and I are both night owls, and also pretty antisocial. It was around 11:30 p.m., and Ben and I were chatting quietly with the lights off in our room. There was a natural lull in our conversation when we were both on our phones, and there was suddenly a knock at the door to the tune of a shave and a haircut. We both froze instantly and stayed silent. There were a few more seconds of silence, then the knock repeated. This pattern continued for about 5 minutes before I started freaking out silently to Ben beside me. We were both stark nude and were expecting no one. Ben and I quietly walked out the room and to the door, looking out the peephole, and saw no one. We were still freaking out and walked to the kitchen and both grabbed steak knives to give ourselves some semblance of a safe feeling. When attempting to go back to our room, the knock happened again twice more, and Ben ordered me to get in the bedroom and hid just out of sight in case something got ugly and needed to surprise attack whoever this was. He looked out the peephole again, and before I could ask him if he saw anyone, he flung the door open and walked onto the balcony, still naked. I hissed at him to get back inside, and he did just that before locking the door again. He said no one was there, and proceeded to lock us and the cats in the room for the night. We really hope it was a case of someone having the wrong apartment. When telling my parents, they were pissed that I hadn't called the police, saying it very well could have been an attempt of burglary of what little valuables we own. Small side note, my 9-year-old sister lives with our grandmother in the same complex and building, but a different apartment. I pushed and asked if she had attempted pranking us, ready to tear her a new one about how she could have been hurt. She very heavily insisted she didn't, because she had to be up early the next day for a summer camp trip. Whoever knocked on our door at nearly midnight, for all of our safety, let's not meet again. My husband was a trucker with a cross-country firm at the time. His driving partner separated from his girlfriend, and according to my husband, couldn't afford to get his own place. I did find that odd, as he made as much money as my husband, who clearly could afford the roof over our heads. My little one was a newborn, and I was off on maternity leave. So Buddy moves into our spare room and makes himself at home. And I do mean at home. He'd walk into the living room and change the channel while I was watching TV, or turn on the stereo, fry himself a steak as a midnight snack, or eat an entire box of donuts and thought nothing of it. He'd take a shower and drop his dirty clothes on the floor for me to pick up and wash. And he stared at me a lot. I found him creepy and inconsiderate and told my husband so. And finally, after a few months of arguing about our unwelcome charity case, who never paid a cent, I told my husband it was either him or me. This sparked a huge argument between the two of them, with Buddy accusing my husband of being whipped and not standing up for his friend. That did it for my husband, and he told the guy he needed to get out now. My husband drove him to a hotel, and we thought that was the end of it. The next day, we went to get groceries, as I had stopped buying anything but essentials so Buddy wouldn't eat us out of house and home. Imagine our shock when we get home and Buddy walks out of the kitchen wearing my husband's clothes and smoking his pipe. As you can imagine, feces hit the fan, and I went straight to the kitchen and phoned the police. In those days, there was no 911, so it was taking a bit, and he heard me talking. He bolted out the house and we never saw him again, and he never showed up at work either. We discovered that he had broken a basement window to get in, so we boarded up the basement and changed the locks. Around a week or so later, I decided to use my cash nest egg that I had stashed in my underwear drawer, and it was gone, and I realized several pair of my underpants were gone as well. Gross. I considered phoning the cops again at that point, but we decided we didn't want to remind him of our existence, and we moved shortly after. I hope the next tenants never got an unexpected and unwelcome house guest. I was a domiciliary carer in a small town in the UK. This meant I had to go from house to house to provide personal care and support for elderly and disabled people in their own home. My shifts were variable from a nice and easy short to a lengthy split shift. This meant I started at 7 a.m. in the morning and finished at 10:30 in the evening. One day my manager called me in the office to have a meeting about a couple of new clients, which a few had fallen off my route that day. She handed me over the care plans and other files, including care notes, where you have to document everything you have done to the client on the time of visit, including personal care, housekeeping tasks, and documenting medications. So she told me to have a nice late shift and sent me back to work with the brand new client. As I found the address, I was a bit creeped out by the look of the client's house. It was a detached 2-story house with an untidy, abandoned-looking garden. Windows were opaque from years of dirt built up on the glass panes. The staircase windows were covered with sheets of building site plastic wraps, and I opened the gate and walked to the side of the house where the main entrance was. The door was a simple UPVC door with a door cam fitted to the right side of the frame with a doorbell button. I pressed the button, heard the doorbell ring inside, and shortly after a vicious dog barked from inside. A few moments later, a middle-aged man looked out of the window from my right side of the door and asked me, "What do you want?" I introduced myself as Frank, and that I was from the care company, and that was here to help him in his daily life. He reluctantly let me into his home, and as I entered, the hairs on the back of my head started to rise. The inside of his house was a huge mess. Dog hairs covered the floor in thick layers. The smell of untidiness was overwhelming. I need to describe the layout of his home for you to understand. As I stepped in, on my immediate left, there was the staircase leading to the upper floor, barricaded with a child barrier. On my right were a wardrobe for coats and shoes. In front of me were the door of the living room and the lounge, and on the far right was a short lobby leading into the dining room and kitchen. So my client invited me to have a seat in the lounge and we started to talk. The guy seemed okay, and I had a chat with him, mainly to convince him about the service we provided, and he needs it because of his living conditions. The conversation went fine. I had spent my allocated visit time just to make him comfortable with the service we provided. Everything went fine, so my unease had gone, and I realized my allocated visit time had drawn to an end. I had to say goodbye to the client after I was done with my care notes, and I have another route for the next few weeks, and had completely forgotten about that creepy house and the rather creepy man to take care of. When I noticed in my schedule that I have him again for 2 hours to spend, like cleaning his home and such, no personal care was in sight because this client was very shy. When I go, I'm given the task to vacuum his dining room, which I started doing, but the vacuum cleaner didn't work. I wondered why. I turned the vacuum cleaner over and saw all the brushes were thickly covered with dog hair. I cleaned it out as best I could and started to clean his dining room out when a big chunk of grey carpet was ripped off by the vacuum cleaner. I freaked out. I had now destroyed his carpet. When I realized his carpet wasn't grey at all but a nice magenta. It looked grey because of years' worth of dog hair stomped into the carpet. I grabbed a knife and used it as a spatula to try and get the dog hairs out. When I loosened up the dog hairs, I started to roll up the carpet. It was so thick. I took it out to the front yard as the backyard was an utter jungle with overgrowth and weeds, as well as other vegetation. It was impossible for me to move in the backyard. Then I was greeted by his next door neighbor, Jack. "Hello, how are you doing? Are you moving Joe out?" he asked, as I returned his greeting and said, "No, I'm just cleaning out his house. I'm only here for domestic reasons." "Well, good luck with him," Jack said. The unease had returned to me, but I tried brushing it off. I managed to clean his dining room and make it look like a dining room instead of a dog kennel, and I wrote in my care notes and moved on to my next client. The following week I had him again, and my next task was the kitchen, so I started to clean up the rather messy kitchen. The washing up sink felt like I was working in a sewer instead of a sink. When I finally managed to clear up the mess and clean and tidy Joe's kitchen cupboards, I went to rinse my cloth out when I saw him standing at the kitchen door. I did not realize the situation at my first glance, so I turned to the sink to rinse the cloth when I felt a chill go down my spine. He had a machete in his hands, grasped very tight that his fingers were going white. I looked at him, and he stared at me, but not with a glaze of a nice gentleman, but with a glimmer of insanity in his eyes. I glanced at my watch, and my visit time was near its end, and I said, "Look, Joe, my visit's over. My other clients are waiting for me. Will you let me write my care notes and grab my coat and car and leave?" He didn't answer, nor move. He just kept staring at me with that insane glance, my eyes darting between him and the machete. I moved forwards towards him and he backed up, but kept staring at me with the insanity in his eyes that got worse with every second. I went into the lounge, not taking my eyes off Joe, in case he were to charge at me. I grabbed my coat that had contained my car keys and flat keys and my ID, put it on, then slowly walked out of the lounge. Joe was standing at the lounge door with the machete in hand, ready to stab. I walked steadily towards him, and he backed up into the kitchen's lobby. To my best of luck, as he forgot to take his keys out the main door, as I walked towards the main entrance, always facing Joe. I reached the front door, turned the keys and opened it, backed out, down the 2 steps he had in the front door to the driveway. He started to come after me but stopped at his front door, and he slammed on his front door so hard that the glass pane just exploded out the door. I backed up to the front yard's gate, then opened it, when dread got down to my very bones. His dog was unleashed and charging at me with a frothing mouth. I was able to shut the main gate right before that dog reached it. The dog collided with the gate with a very loud crash, barking at me ferociously. I opened my car, then started it up, and didn't even care about traffic on the main road. I reversed into full throttle and then sped away from the creepy house. I wrote everything down on my notes, and all that they said to me was, "Oh, he has a mental illness." A few weeks later, I was sacked because I refused to work with him again. I was about 5 years old when my dad and I drove up to my sister's high school to pick her up from sports practice. He asked me to walk to the gym to tell her it was time to go home. It wasn't dark outside, but it was well after school hours, and there weren't people milling about on campus. Everything was quiet, and there was no one around. I was walking along this outdoor breezeway when this older man approached me. He had dark, wavy hair, a big mustache, tight jeans, and a paisley brown and cream shirt. I can still see him in my mind today. He stopped me to supposedly ask directions somewhere, and then he started asking me other questions. He squatted down to my eye level and asked me how old I was, what grade I was in, and finally what my name was. When I told him my name, he said, "Hey, that's my name too, isn't that cool?" And I believed him, and asked if he could walk with me. I remember feeling very uncomfortable and intimidated, but I was going to go with him anyway because he was an adult, and it never occurred to me that I didn't have to go with him. I was supposed to do what adults told me, in my little kid mind, and if I didn't, well, it meant I had bad manners, and I took pride in being a polite and well-mannered child, something other adults would often compliment about me. And then there was the fact that he had been nice to me, so I didn't want to be rude to him. As I started to walk with him, my dad suddenly came rushing up, took me by the hand, and said something in a harsh tone to the mustached man. He quickly turned heel and walked away fast, and I remember being confused, because even though he made me feel weird, he had been so nice and friendly, and now he was rushing off without even saying goodbye. Still, I was relieved that my dad was there because it meant I didn't have to go with this man who made me feel uncomfortable. I come to find out my dad was parked in a place where from his car he could see me still, so when he saw the man squatting down to talk to me, he knew something was off and that I could have been in danger. With the benefit of hindsight as an adult, I feel without a doubt that this man was a child predator, and I shudder to think what could have happened had my dad not seen what was going down and come to my aid. I grew up in rural Texas, in a small town, with a crippling meth problem. No positive outlets for people to do activities like a movie theater or park, and we didn't even have a large grocery store just to hang out in. The teens mostly just ended up drinking, driving, and going to bonfires. But quite a few of the teenage boys in my neighborhood decided that being evil was the best way to have fun. They would literally go out of their way while either trying to drive and swerve and scare younger kids riding bikes, or poison loose dogs and even set fire to a few of the trailers in my neighborhood while people were still inside them. Only one arrest was ever made in connection to the arsons, but it had definitely been a group activity. My neighborhood was a trailer park, in which each trailer was placed on a few acres of land, with at least some forested area between each plot of property. The road was an older dirt road with gravel and rocks poured over the dirt, which is what I had to learn to ride a bike on. It was difficult. One day when I was around 10, I was doing my best to ride the bike on this rock road without falling while riding away from my house when I saw my older sister, who was about 16 at the time, sprinting alongside the road towards me from the opposite direction. I was going very slow, trying to keep my balance, but decided to just get off the bike when I noticed how panicked my sister looked. I saw a dust cloud coming from the road, but a fairly large hill was blocking the view of my sister from any vehicles that were coming towards us. When my sister got to me, she grabbed my arm so hard that I winced in pain, and she pulled me away from the bike. By this time, the truck that was producing the dust trail was just coming over the hill, but it was still fairly far away, so I didn't think they noticed us. There are woods around 10 feet on both sides of the road, where I and my sister were, as my sister was pulling me into the woods on the left side of it. I complained and was asking her what was going on, but she told me to hurry. We made it about 30 feet into the woods when my sister dropped to the ground and pulled me with her. She covered my mouth and told me to be quiet. Again, I complied, and I saw the vehicle she was worried about. A black truck filled with 5 guys that were in their late teens or very early 20s. The truck screeched to a stop right where my bike was, and I froze solid when I heard my sister whisper, "Crap." 3 of the guys got out the car, but they didn't say anything. It was clear that they were looking very intensely into the woods on both sides of the road. Luckily, for some reason I'm not sure of, they all lined up and started approaching and walking into the woods on the opposite side of the road. They were talking, but we couldn't make out what they were saying. I was worried that they would take their time looking for us, since only a handful of people lived this far down the road, and it could have taken hours before another car would pass through. It took about 5 minutes of perfect stillness and silence before one did, though. One of the guys had already placed my bike into the back of the truck, and then they noticed another car coming over the hill behind them. They quickly jumped into the truck and sped off. We waited at least 10 minutes before we stood up and started the walk back home, although we walked right along the tree line instead of the road itself, just in case. My sister didn't say much to me, but told my mum when we got home that one of the boys that she had been hanging out with was talking about wanting to kill some of the annoying kids in the neighborhood, and she assumed that it would be a good bet that one of those annoying kids might end up being one of her 3 younger siblings. It could have been any of us, but I was the one that wanted to go ride my bike alone that day instead of playing video games with my 2 brothers. She decided to head home when none of the other guys seemed to go against the guy talking about wanting to kill kids, or even jokingly escalate his desire to kill annoying kids with more detail. She'd been running home and just got enough of a head start before the boys hopped into their truck to stop whatever they might have done. The cops were informed, but apparently the boys disagreed, and parents claimed they never left the trailer, so nothing ever came of it. I knew 2 of the boys' names because we lived in the same neighborhood in a small town, and I know they never got less evil. They later invited my sister to a bonfire party everyone was going to be at, but my sister decided not to go, and when she asked all her friends how the party was, literally no one knew about it. This is because she was the only one they invited. She stayed away from them ever since, and fortunately, neither of us live there anymore. Of the 2 that I knew, one is currently incarcerated for several drug-related offenses, but the other one is still out there. As for the other 3 that were in the truck, I have no idea where they are or what they're up to. So to the garbage boys in the truck, you can keep my bike, because I hope we never meet again. I am a female who was 23 when this occurred back in 2016. I was moving from New York City to Boston. 2 college friends, also female, agreed to live with me, and we started looking for an apartment. We were fond of one place in particular, out in the suburbs next to a forest park. I got talking with the landlord, an older man probably in his 70s, and mentioned that I repair antique dolls. He excitedly said he had a doll his mother's uncle had brought her back from Germany in World War I, and the elastic holding on the arms had worn out. I said I could definitely fix it, and we exchanged contact info. He was firm that my work would have to take place at his house since he was nervous about moving a fragile antique, but at the time I didn't think anything of it. Now that I'm older and wiser, I know doll doctor house calls are not the norm. Ultimately, we went with another place closer to the city proper, but I didn't want to lose a prospective doll repair client, and I called him a week or so after we got settled, and once again he seemed delighted to get his family heirloom fixed. Nothing seemed odd until I asked for his address to work out how to get there. "Don't worry," he said. "I'll pick you up. What's your new address?" My eagerness cooled a bit. I tried to put him off by saying that I didn't want to bring him out of his way, and I could get myself there no problem, but he kept insisting. Never even told me which town he lived in. just repeated over and over that it was fine, he'd pick me up, and that it would be no trouble at all. Eager for the business, and a bit embarrassed about my paranoia, I caved. I told him my address, and we arranged a date and time for him to pick me up. Over the next few days, literally everyone in my life told me to call and cancel. My housemates asked me if I'd lost my mind. My mum and sister both told me I was driving them mad with worry, and to be honest, I think I was looking for an excuse to call the whole thing off. It just didn't feel right. I called the evening before the appointed day, and left a message saying that something had come up. I added that if he was free the following Monday, my housemate could drive me over, so he wouldn't be inconvenienced, which was true. She offered in a last-ditch effort to make me see sense. The next day, the time we'd picked rolled around, and I was sitting in the living room working on a sewing project, when a car pulled up in front of the house. I looked down, and my heart jumped when I recognized the old man sitting in the driver's seat. He didn't look up, and didn't appear to see me, and just sat there for what felt like a century until finally he started the car and drove off. I never saw him again, and he never contacted me about getting his mother's precious doll repaired. And maybe I was overreacting to an innocent old guy with poor social skills who forgot to call back, but I had a bad feeling about the situation and ultimately think I did the right thing. The part that creeps me out the most is I almost had this man for my landlord. It could have been fine, or it could have been much, much worse. I am a short, medium-sized girl. One day around a year ago, I was pregnant and made a trip out to Target to buy some things. I'm a very cautious person and constantly looking at my surroundings with mild paranoia. Mostly inherited from my mum, who raised 3 kids on her own. She was always on her guard. I got out of the car, which I parked a little far away from the store entrance, for 2 reasons. I didn't want to get any dents from other drivers, and I tried to get as much exercise as I could since I was pregnant. As I'm walking, I notice a huge red truck with 3 men inside with the windows down. I assumed they were waiting for someone inside the store, but something creeped up my neck when I made eye contact with the driver. I quickly turned away and immediately began to feel self-conscious. A small girl, visibly pregnant, and I suddenly felt so vulnerable. Up until that point, my pregnancy was smooth and had never made me feel like a target. Once I finally got in the store, I felt more relaxed and went about my shopping. When I left the store and noticed the truck was still there, I put my bag in the trunk and got in the car and quickly turned it on and drove away. I noticed in my rearview mirror, the truck was also taking off with only the same 3 men inside. My heart sank. I realized they weren't waiting for anyone inside the store. I got in the lane that can only be a left turn, and they were on a lane that can only go straight a few cars behind me. I thought, great, we're not going in the same direction, and I was just being paranoid. As I passed the light turning, I see the red truck switch the lane I was in to turn left. I sped up to catch with the next light turning yellow to put as much distance between me and them. I drove a little faster than usual and realized even if I made it home they could still follow me there and I would be going back to an empty home. So instead I drove past my street to a shopping center that had a Starbucks. The drive-through wraps around the building so you aren't visible to the main road I was driving in. I'm getting into the drive-through and notice the red truck going on the road I just left. They drive past the Starbucks and I think, good. As I'm still in the drive-through, I see the truck pass by again in the opposite direction, almost as if they were looking for me. I wait in the drive-through for the other cars to leave at this time, and I call my sister and tell her that I'm heading to her place, as I didn't want to go home alone and my boyfriend wouldn't be home for several hours. As I'm driving to my sister's house, which is about 25 minutes away, my mind just begins to wander. What would have happened if they'd have caught me? Had these men been following me from before? Any danger that could have happened to me or my baby made me so paranoid that I didn't leave my house for the remainder of my pregnancy. I was shaking by the time I got to my sister's and told her all the details I could remember. To the creepy man in that red truck, I've never seen you since, but please, let's not meet. My wife always tells me I need to make a book about the creepy things I've encountered. I co-owned a local delivery service. There was a woman called Sue who constantly did odd things upon delivery. She was in mid-50s, grey hair, and solid moustache for a woman, and creepy as hell. She progressively got worse. It started with little odd things. She would say, "Have you ever tried beef? It's delicious." And come to the door with her face covered in grease and say, "It's a new face treatment." One of my favorites was me miscounting change at the end of a long day. I realized my mistake and went to correct it. She matter-of-factly stated, "Laser beams to the back of your head make you stupid," and then slammed the door closed in my face. She once told me, "I once had a party thrown for my many achievements. They turned a basement into a club for me. I go into the basement and there's hundreds of people applauding. When I turn around, Tom Hanks was there, and I said, 'Tommy, you get out of here.'" None of these were provoked or requested conversations, bear in mind. And she just went off and you'd have to stand there and nod along. It kept getting worse. She started tossing piles of garbage outside her townhouse and would drop piles of quarters out of her hand, which would roll into the trash pile and then ask you to pick them up. I told all the drivers to refuse and make her get more money. Then one day, it all hit the fan. As I parked, as there was enough blocking my car that she couldn't see where I parked, I hear her scream, "Who are you?" I knock, tell her the total, and she acts like she has the money, and has her hand closed and drops it in my hand. "Nothing," I chuckle. She points to the ground, clearly dazed, and says, "Money. There was something round on the ground, maybe a rock." I state it's not money, and she goes inside saying her friend will pay me. Confused, I question it, and she walks away with an odd look, saying she will find money or he will pay me. I figure she's odd. Screw it. I'm waiting and waiting, and she's closed her glass door, but not the wooden door, and I open the door and holler, "Sue, I need to get going." But there's nothing. I peek in to see if something's wrong, and I decide to open the door and go in. I turn to the right and see a couch with her feet sticking out from behind it. I assume Sue had a heart attack and hurry towards her. As I approach, I hear her grunt like an animal but still only see feet. I round the corner cautiously and see Sue on her hands and knees digging into the ground like a dog. She was grunting and I see white spit foaming from her lips. She turns to face me and I've run faster than I ever had in my life. I jumped in my car and did 50 out of there. I called the cops to do a wellness check but never heard anything from it. I checked the papers for her name, nothing. What still weirds me out is that she called twice a day and never called again after that day. Still gives me the creeps. Sue, never call again. We will not go there, and your existence haunts my dreams. This happened to me on New Year's Eve a year ago. I was at this party where a bunch of friends had gathered to just hang out, eat, and celebrate together. Nothing crazy in particular happened during the event itself, but rather when I was on my way home. As I was walking along the sidewalk, I think it must have been about 3 a.m. or something, I saw this middle-aged man coming in my direction. I thought little of it. I just assumed he was merely passing until I noticed that he was starting to slow down as we neared each other. I think he smiled as I walked past him. Not a crazy smile or anything, so I smiled back. Just as I thought that I'd been stupidly suspicious about this man, I heard him call out from behind me, like he was after me. I stopped in my tracks and faced him to see what he wanted, and I saw him walking back towards me, his arms outstretched. As he stopped in front of me, he reached out his hands as if he wanted to shake mine. This was when I began to get a little more apprehensive about the situation. I'm sure he must have noticed how I hesitated before I decided to shake his hand. I don't want to be a suspicious person, but I considered the possibility that he might be concealing a knife in his sleeve, or his coat, or that he may try to mug me, or something worse. I thought about what would happen if I started to run. Would he just shrug and continue on his way? Or would he follow? All of these thoughts flashed through my mind until I decided to take his hand. I thought that I could always pull myself free and run the hell away if necessary. He then started asking me stuff about what I'd been doing this New Year's Eve, if I had a good time, things like that. He was shaking my hand all the while, and even though I was still on edge, I started to realize this man didn't pose a threat to me. For politeness' sake, I asked him if he had a good time too. After a short while, he let go, said Happy New Year, and went on down the sidewalk. He was probably under the influence, but he must have been one of those people who become happy when they're drunk. I felt stupid but relieved too, and continued on my way home. In the end, he didn't mean me any harm. Perhaps he was kind of sweet. I'll never forget the indecisiveness and spark of fear that ran through me at the moment that he stretched out his hand to me. Because who really knows what's going to happen when you meet a stranger? Every year my family gets together with friends to stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve and have a party. When we do, we usually shoot fireworks and burn our Christmas trees as a normal celebration of the new year. We live far out in the country, and bonfires are normal. Across the street under the streetlight there is this camp of sorts where people work. We set off our fireworks around midnight, and there's this guy standing under the streetlight, silhouetted, and he's glaring at us. He was just across the street but far enough away that we couldn't see his face, along with it being pitch black save for the light of the bonfire. I pointed out, and it freaks us out a bit, but we try laughing it off. After a while longer of shooting fireworks, we look back and he's still standing there. He wasn't there for a long time, just standing under the streetlight, and it creeped us out. Me and the other kids would joke around and yell at him to mind his own business, but he stayed there and didn't stop staring at us. I remember him either laughing or whistling or something. We did it back for humor, but it was quite creepy. He was there for literally hours. Later on, we'd pretty much forgotten all about him, and looking back, he was gone. I don't know who he was or why he did that. This was a few years back. The street lighting he was under is still there today, and I have that very sinister memory. I wonder why he was there, watching us for so long. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I profoundly hope that you enjoyed tonight's stories, as well as the amazingly produced live action horror story by Dark Echoes. Please, please, please check them out. They're seriously underrated, and I know you guys will like their work. So check out their videos, show them some love, let them know that I sent you. Maybe put that in a little comment on one of their videos. I'd like that. And yeah, enjoy. Oh look, the link is on screen now. Go ahead and click it. It is some seriously good stuff. But for now, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.